There won't be much left of me by 27.
Hello, good evening. Hi. Hi, thank you guys for joining us tonight. I'm Amanda Lima, the town engineer, and a project that we're helping implement based off getting grant funding from the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Grant is helping us look at our municipal buildings and services that we're providing the residents and trying to, evaluate them and to figure out how susceptible they are to flood inundation. So with me tonight, I've got Woods Hole Group in their group that they'll be presenting on and getting some feedback from everyone. So I appreciate everyone for coming out tonight.
Thanks, Amanda. My name is Brittany Hofnagel, and I am a climate resiliency specialist with Woods Hole Group. With me, I have Annie O'Connell and Justine Rooney. And we're going to go over what we're calling the Yarmouth Climate Change Vulnerability Assessment and Adaptation Plan. And as Amanda said, it's the result of receiving MVP grants that I'll explain in just a second. Thanks. We're going to start off tonight with going over a quick introduction, talk about some of the climate data that we have. We'll have a quick 10-minute breakout section interacting with some posters, and then we'll discuss the CCVA project in more detail. We'll talk about next steps and then follow up with a breakout session that will not be recorded. Oh, I think it's working. So as we mentioned, this project is the result of a grant funding from the Municipality Vulnerability Preparedness Program. This started back in June of 2019 when the town completed their MVP workshop. And that was a town process to kind of identify town-wide hazards and develop some broad adaptation strategies or further next steps to provide resolutions to some of those issues the town is facing. And one of the top ranking strategies was developing an infrastructure vulnerability assessment inventory. So we then worked with Amanda and the town to develop a grant application to do a climate vulnerability adaptation strategy and assessment. And the goal of that project, the one that we're working on now, is to develop a list of highest ranked assets that can then taken further to develop implementable strategies in the framework of climate change and sea level rise. So this project, when I reiterate that this was a collaborative approach across many of the town departments, we worked with the fire department, the Department of Natural Resources, municipal buildings, the water department, and the DPW. So we engaged a lot of the town staff in order to really hear their concerns and develop ways to assess all of the assets across those properties. So before we get started, I kind of want to just do this interactive piece. I have 4 pictures of some storms that have impacted Yarmouth in the past. And just wanted to gauge if anybody in the room here can identify some of these storms. So let's start with the top left corner. So we want to.
That's like every other week at that spot.
Every other week at that spot. Okay. Anyone else?
Bob or a king tide.
Okay. Yep. So the upper left is the January 2023 storm or high water event. At the 43 Shore Road property. What about the upper right-hand corner?
Fastball, it's got to be,
Oh, that was over the winter.
yeah, maybe October of last year or
Oh, December. No, December was the south storm.
Right.
This was north.
Oh, I didn't realize these were in this order, but the lower left corner, that's Hurricane Bob. Then this one in the bottom right corner is the hurricane of 44. And then the top right-hand corner is Grays Beach during September 2020, during a high tide. All right, so I do have some engagement questions for those that are watching from home or participating on Zoom. There is a QR code that if you use your phone camera to take a snap of the QR code, that will take you to a survey that has these 3 questions that if you can answer at home, feel free to engage. But I'm also going to ask these questions to our guest here. So how often have you experienced roadway flooding that has restricted your access to town services? So raise your hand if you have experienced roadway flooding that might have prevented you from accessing town services.
Well, not necessarily assessing them, but I had to go down to the sailing center to see any damage that came in, and I couldn't get there because of the road flooding.
Okay, so you couldn't access the sailing center because of road flooding to assess damage. Anyone else?
Open to everybody? Or?
Yeah, go for it.
Well, like I said, the Shore Road one, oftentimes, public or town vehicles can't access and continue down Shore Road unless you want to risk the chance of some damage to your vehicle. So that's pretty reoccurring theme in that location. Grays Beach, you showed the king tide in September of 2020, I think you said. That also, and starting from October through the winter when you get nor'easters predominant out of there, oftentimes public can't use that boardwalk. We have to board it off for safety reasons.
Right.
So those 2 spots are very vulnerable. And as you and I have discussed Packet Landing, there's times that we've had a hard time accessing the docks to our Harbor Patrol boats.
Right. Anyone else want to share sentiment? I'll ask the next question. All right, so raise your hand or feel free to comment. How often has flooding prevented your access to open space or areas? So have you not been able to access a beach or a park because a road was flooded? No? Okay. And it might be the case that, you're not traveling to those locations during a storm event. I think more so if you experience a king tide and you are expecting to go to a beach, that would be a case where your travel might be restricted. The third question, how concerned are you about accessing emergency services before, during, or after a coastal hazard event? So what are your concerns? Feel free to raise your hand if you're really concerned and add feedback or input.
It all depends on where you live.
Okay.
I live in Yarmouth Ward, so it's generally not an issue.
Okay. So your concern about access to emergency services differs based on where you live in Yarmouth. Okay. Okay, and I think the results of this project will kind of highlight those differences between the north and the south. Very good. All right. So I just want to take a moment to start walking you through the actual project and how we got to where we are today. We usually follow this vulnerability risk assessment framework that's broken up into 3 phases. Phase 1 being collecting that sea level rise data and the climate change data so that we can understand the risks of these coastal hazards. Another aspect of this project is gathering the asset inventory. So working with the town departments, working with the GIS coordinator to take an inventory of all of the critical assets across town, and then determining those critical elevations of those assets. So what part of that building would cause, if a part of a building got flooded from a storm or king tide flooding, what would cause that building to fail? Could it be the first floor elevation or the basement windowsill, considering those type of places along a building? We are using the Commonwealth State Standard for Climate Change and Adaptation Planning. It's called the Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model. It's a sophisticated hydrodynamic storm surge and sea level rise model. Incorporated into the model are the sea level rise projections that are supported by coastal zone management. If you want to hear more information about what the sea level rise projections are, please feel free to look at Resilient MA online, and they have a breakdown and description of what projections are being used. But just in general, in this model, we incorporate sea level rise, tropical, extratropical storms. We look at the elevations across the landscape, how the different geological features across the landscape differ, and also incorporate how climate change is going to change in the future, both intensity and frequency. We also incorporate sea level rise, storms, tides, wind and wave setups, and all of those other physical processes that we would expect from coastal storms. We then simulate that model over thousands and thousands of iterations, where we're able to use the results of this model to assess the town infrastructure. And the results look like this. So we call these the probability of inundation maps. And along the scale along the bottom, you'll see a scale going from pink to that dark blue, from a 0.1% chance to 100% chance. And this really describes what your annual chance of flooding might be if you're in a particular location across the landscape. So if you're in this light purple, in looking at present day, if you're along Run Pond Road area, you're in this purple color, which correlates to 10%. So that's a 1 in 10 year storm. So every 10 years, you have a significant chance of becoming flooded from that storm. So every year, based on where you are in the landscape and the color or the percentage that you're standing on, that describes your annual chance of becoming flooded from a storm. You can see how these results change through time, both in extent and severity. So you now see that the Run Pond has now turned to the 25%. So every given year, by 2030, you would have a 25% chance of getting flooded, and through 2050 and 2070. What I will say, if you notice, the northern side of Yarmouth is facing Cape Cod Bay. The storm conditions and the type of storms that you might expect from Cape Cod Bay differ in the physical processes that are associated with storms that might hit the south, which explains some of that variability and differences you see between the north and the south of Yarmouth. So at this point, I want to give everyone an opportunity to interact with some of these maps. We are going to take a pause for 10 minutes to have those in the room interact with these two maps that we have. But viewers from home or on Zoom can also use these QR codes, and there's a series of maps on this survey that will basically ask you the same 3 questions we're asking of our attendees in person. So there's 3 maps that, one, you can put a dot where you might have experienced flooding in the past. You can put a dot in places that you visit frequently. And you can also put a dot where you might work or where you spend time at home. So putting those dots in location will help us understand where you as residents of the town spend your time and how those relate to the flooding extents that we're showing. So we're going to keep this stagnant map up on the screen for about 10 minutes, while inside in the room we're going to interact with these paper maps. So we'll be back to present in about 10 minutes. So everyone here, if you want to look at these two maps, they're showing the 2030 1% storm surge and the 2070 1% storm surge. And you can use red dots for where you've observed flooding, yellow dots where you work or live, and green dots where places you visit frequently. Nope, that's the purpose. Yes, we printed these for session and move along in the presentation. That way we don't lose those watching on Zoom. All right. So my goal was to look at some of these maps and kind of talk about some of the areas that we've bulleted. On this one on the left, I see some members here like to visit some of the beaches. Packet Landing is a place that people like to visit. Gray's Beach is a location for visiting. And then there's several locations that people live that seem to be out of the flood zones that are showing on our maps right now. And there's some places in the middle. There's some places in the middle that people are liking to visit. What is showing on an other map? All right. This other map again, so flooding on this side is Gray's Beach and Packet Landing and Bass River Beach, some areas in the park, the neighborhood west of Bass River Beach, and some locations on, what is that bay called? Lewis Bay. All right, so a lot more flooding dots on this map. So yeah, and another couple houses that are outside the flood zone. So it looks like those that are attended here in today's meeting are kind of safe until 2070. So that's good news. All right, and we will, if anyone from home responded to the survey, we'll take a look at those after the meeting. All right, so I want to go through the next couple of phases of the project. Again, reiterated, this was a town collaboration across departments. And so the first thing we really did is talk to each of these departments and really understand what the assets were across the properties, whether it's buildings. So we went out in the field. We went and collected information and data on a variety of assets associated with water department, DNR, DPW, beaches, things like that, the golf course, the public golf course. And so we surveyed buildings and transformers and generators, roadways, important storage and outbuildings, bathhouses, pump stations. So we tried really hard to get a really informed collective asset inventory so that we could assess against our climate change data. So what we found is we developed a database. We developed a repository of information for all of those critical assets that we wanted to assess in this vulnerability assessment. The one thing that we did utilize is our 2070 results for our MCFRM, and we used the furthest inland extent of our model to be kind of our threshold of concern. So we used the extent of the 0.1% chance storm, that annual chance of 0.1%, to kind of isolate those critical facilities that we wanted to assess in this this assessment. So if you can notice, we have some of the pump stations, we have the town hall, the old fire main station here. And you'll notice by 2070, from that 0.1% extent, there's a lot of high ground in the middle, and we have a lot of facilities kind of towards that more inland extent of flooding. So they think the good news here is that a lot of the town services, whether it's town hall, DPW buildings, the fire department station, are kind of more further inland and at the higher ground, and so is not as vulnerable to those facilities and structures that are along the coast. So I want to keep that in mind, that as we went through this process, we started to realize that a lot of these town service buildings were pretty well protected and further inland. once we completed the asset inventory, we then used the asset inventory to assess their probability of risk to sea level rise and storm surge. And the next phase of this framework is once we map the inundation for all of those assets, we need to score the consequence. So again, if those assets would become inundated, we wanted to understand what the criticality of those assets were, shall they become flooded. And so for that part of the project, we, again, worked with each of the departments to really to assign the criticality scoring for each of those assets. So we scored all of the assets on a range of categories. So area of service loss, duration of service loss, so how long would an asset be down if it would fail because of flooding. Cost of damage, what is the appropriate or the approximate cost of either fixing or replacing that asset if it was to become damaged. The impact on public safety and emergency services, impact on important economic activity, impact on public health and environment. So those were the 6 categories we used, and based on the length of time or the area service or the impact on public safety, we ranked all of the assets on a scale of 0 to 4. So this provided us a really nice matrix of the criticality of each of these assets. And for this example, we're going to highlight the Packet Landing Marina over along Bass River. So we were able to, again, work with the town departments and really collaboratively score each of our assets. And so you'll see a list of assets. Packet Landing here is highlighted, and you can see the scores that we gave Packet Landing. So for service loss, we gave it a 4, only because it provides commercial access, it provides emergency services and recreational services. So it's a resource or an asset that is used by the entire town, not only for the town municipality, but also for residents. 4 was also assigned for service loss duration. If that marina happened to be significantly damaged, it could take upwards of months to repair or replace or fix. Damage cost was, we had at 1. And then public safety emergency services was a 4 because of those emergency services with the storage of the fire department boat, the DNR boat, and the harbor master boat at that location. Economic impact was a 2, and public health and environment was a 1. And then based on a formula, we can calculate total criticality score. So again, when you rank those assets based on the criticality score, we can identify those assets that are most critical for the town. So once we do this criticality scoring, we can also multiply those values to the probability of inundation. So again, we mapped those assets against our climate change data and able to create a total CCVA score, or total risk score. So if you multiply the criticality score and the annual chance of flooding, we get this risk score. And so we can develop a database of all of the assets and how they rank across each other so that we can rank them from high priority to low priority. And we did this on a town-wide basis for all of the assets we collected. And by no surprise, all of the top ranking assets for this project are coastal infrastructure. So as I mentioned before, a lot of the town buildings and town services assets are not vulnerable in 2030 timeframe. And so it makes sense to us to identify that a lot of our top ranking assets are along the coastal front, with Packet Landing Marina being the highest vulnerable asset, followed by Wilbur Park Boat Dock, Grays Beach Boat Dock. We can then filter this list if we would decide to take out all of those coastal infrastructures and really just focus on the buildings. These are the top 5 buildings that ranked highest in that vulnerability assessment. So the Yarmouth Sailing Center, Taylor Bray Farm and its buildings, Bass River Beach Bathhouse, and those other bathhouses. And I also, again, we just created a few graphics to kind of isolate and show you the results of some of these assets that ranked high. So this is the Packet Landing Marina. Just to orient you a little bit, this darkest blue is mean high water in present day, then followed by 2030, 2050, 2070. And then this green color is that 1% chance of flooding in that 2030 time horizon. And you can see, so you can see in this map, the blues, and showing how mean high water is going to impact the marina, and then also show the extent of flooding from that 2070, or the 2030, 2030 1% chance storm event. So it's a very vulnerable location. We've already experienced mean high water, king tide flooding of this location. So we already know that in existing conditions, we do get some high vulnerability here. So I'm just going to quickly step through these next slides, but they do follow the same colorations. So here's the vulnerability results, the vulnerability to the Englewood Beach and Sailing Center. So you see the blues for the mean high water flooding, and that 1% storm event is mostly covering that entire location. Here is Taylor Bray Farm. So this is a location that is adjacent to salt marsh. So it's not out of expectation that mean high water is going to infiltrate this property in the long term, and is vulnerable to storm conditions as well. This is Packet Landing. Oh, we mislabeled. This is Bass River Beach. And so you can see the impacts of potential mean high water flooding here at the boat ramp, but also along the beach face, along the jetty here. And that the 1% storm condition can go further inland, affecting the bathhouse and the parking lot. Now, I want to reiterate too, once again, I think it was, when working with Amanda, it was no surprise to us that, a lot of the high-ranking assets were along the coastline. I think that makes sense. If you're across the landscape along the coastline, you're going to be severely at risk for coastal flooding and mean high water flooding. What our list did highlight is that those town services, the water department buildings, the pump stations, are not vulnerable in the 2030 time horizon. And really, when we were looking at the data, we had to rank it by 2070. If we can rank all of the vulnerability scores by the 2070 timeframe, that's when we started to see some of those vulnerabilities. So I think the lesson here is that the town is pretty set up well for long-term providing services through those municipality-owned buildings like Town Hall and the fire department and the DPW buildings. So, but I will let you know that because we have different departments working on this project, each department will have access to their own designated list. So the water department list, the water department, by 2070, you can notice the top 3 assets that are vulnerable for the water department. The fire department can also look at their top 3 assets, and so on and so on. So we've really developed a product or deliverable for the town that each department can utilize on their own or as a whole ranking list. The last part of this, which we're not going to really focus on tonight, but the next step of this project is, again, working with the team, working with my company, Woods Hole Group, to kind of prioritize those high-risk assets. So we'll have a ranking list of those high-risk assets, and maybe we come to a decision on what assets we prioritize, so then take further into the adaptation strategy. So that's our next steps. So kind of developing those adaptation strategies on a townwide basis, but also those priority selected assets. So just quickly to touch on this, we will be developing adaptation and resiliency strategies, and most commonly we will develop those on these 4 themes. Avoid, so how can you avoid impacts from flooding? Accommodate, how can you stay where you are but accommodate flooding? So an example would be elevate houses so that water can flow through underneath, but your first floor elevation is protected or dry. Protect is also an option. This would be more of a hard infrastructure like seawalls or revetments. And also one that's not necessarily everyone's favorite is this idea of retreat or relocate. And so some of this might be, you know, purchasing parcels along the water line or along the coast and swapping up to more inland, higher ground locations. So that's kind of the next phase of our project, is really selecting those high priority assets, creating and developing that adaptation plan. Based on the town's decision on those high ranking assets, we'll develop some site visits to get some more involved information, whether it's photos, more detailed measurements. We will be presenting this project to the Board of Selectmen on May 27th, 23, I believe. Oh, June. That's my fault. I'm stuck in May. So June, June 27th, we'll be presenting at the Board of Selectmen. I apologize. And then the second community meeting will be June 28th, which will revealing the adaptation plan. And then by June 30th, we will finish the final report. So this was a year-long project, like most of the state grants. Their fiscal years from July to June. So we've been working really hard with the town and the town departments to go through this project. And we're here. So May to June, stakeholder meetings, community meetings, final report, and by June 30th, we will finalize those deliverables. So that's all I had. We're gonna ask some questions, get some feedback. I think, is there option for questions? If anyone's from home has any questions, we can take the next 5 minutes to answer those. Otherwise, we'll shortly end the Zoom meeting around 7 so that we can finish up the different stations here in person. Yes.
I'd like to say thank you for this year's really hard, concentrated work. Oh, so everyone at home can hear, I want to say thank you from Yarmouth for the hard work you've done this year. It's very well thought through, and we appreciate your expertise.
Thank you. Yeah, I think one of the benefits of this is working collaboratively with Amanda and the team and the town staff that she's been able to gather. And you know, these type of engagement pieces with communities are really important. So it's glad that you're here. Anyone online want to ask a question before we end the Zoom meeting? Okay, I think that's it. So we're going to end the Zoom meeting. Thank you so much. The recording will be made available. The resources will be made available. And thank you who's joining us on Zoom. Thank you for coming tonight and listening. So have a good night. Thanks, everyone. All right. So that's kind of it for the presentation.